T-minus 30 seconds. T-minus 20 seconds. Ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. My life has value.
CIA's mission is to protect the United States from enemies foreign and domestic, but over the years, questions have been raised over whether the CIA's actions live up to its noble goals. We recently shared a video looking at some of the darkest secrets of the CIA. Today, we'll be looking at even more stories that show the sinister and downright bizarre things the CIA has gotten up to over the years. Before we start, please don't forget to help the channel by liking and subscribing to support us for more videos like this one. Sometimes what the CIA got up to was not so much terrifying as it was insane. By the 1960s, gripped by Cold War paranoia, the CIA had become convinced that the Soviets had figured out how to use paranormal senses to gather intelligence. They genuinely believed that the US was vulnerable to these new techniques of parapsychology, and that action had to be taken to counter them. These techniques included psychokinesis, moving objects with the mind, out-of-body experiences, which allowed people to leave their bodies and move around, and remote viewing, which allowed people to see or sense things without any apparent physical way to do so. By 1970, the CIA was funding a research program called SCAN8 to investigate gifted individuals who possessed these special talents. Surprisingly, these early experiments reported an accuracy rate of over 65% in many instances. There was enough perceived success to form a proper project, codenamed Gondola Wish, by 1977. Gondola Wish was supposed to consolidate this parapsychology research so that it could be properly integrated into counterintelligence. It proposed training people in these techniques to act as special agents in Eastern Europe. The documents relating to Gondola Wish treat it with complete seriousness. For example, the CIA put great thought into who might be recruited for such work. They were worried that the paranormal nature of the work would offend some people's religious sensibilities, creating a risk that they would go to the public to expose what they thought was an immoral project. It is also apparent from the documents that for whatever reason, the Soviets were believed to be equally certain of the value of this research. Since Russia does not declassify things in the same manner as the US, we can't really know how far the Soviets really took these experiments. It's even possible that the Soviets were leading the CIA on a wild goose chase to raid their time. Such things were known to happen in the Cold War, but we can only speculate. Most remarkably, the projects reported some success. One individual, Patrick H. Price, was said to have been especially gifted, and experiments with him reportedly returned positive results. Another experiment with remote viewing correctly identified the crash site of a Soviet bomber in South Africa. Yet another one was able to describe the details of a new type of Soviet submarine, whose existence would not be known until months later. Unsurprisingly though, over time it was clear that the research was going nowhere. Most of the experiments with remote viewing and other methods failed. Luck, not supernatural ability, probably explains the perceived successes. Gondola Wish was eventually rolled into a wider US military project called Stargate, but it was obvious that there was nothing to be gained. In 1995, the project was suspended and almost immediately declassified. The CIA spent millions of dollars and several decades researching these strange techniques and had nothing to show for it. However, the question remains, how did it take over 20 years to figure that out? Were the Soviets as convinced by these ideas as the US? Why would either side waste so many resources on something as crazy as this? No one really knows. Some people still believe that the CIA actually learned more than it let on. And while the public documents paint a picture of nonsense and failure, there might be more truth to these experiments than they're ready to admit. Moving from mind powers to mind-altering substances, the CIA has long been accused of being involved in global drug trafficking. As early as the Korean War, the CIA was being accused of forming alliances of convenience with drug smugglers as part of the global struggle against communism. The most famous case came in 1996, when journalist Gary Webb published explosive allegations that the CIA had been fueling the crack cocaine epidemic that had swept through US cities since the 1980s. To understand Webb's accusations, we must first go to Nicaragua. In 1979, a revolution in the country set up a new Marxist government. In response, a number of anti-communist rebel groups emerged known as the Contras. The US inevitably provided support and guidance to the Contras, most famously during the Reagan administration, who hoped to fund the Contras via the illegal sale of weapons to Iran. However, only a small portion of Contra funding came from the US. Instead, it was illegal drugs, mainly crack cocaine, that bankrolled the Contra resistance. The CIA soon became aware of this, and according to Webb, supported and protected this drug trade as a way to ensure the continued funding of the anti-communist resistance. According to Webb, the flood of crack cocaine into American cities in the 1980s was a direct result of the CIA's support of the Contras. He alleged that the CIA actively protected drug runners from prosecution and allowed the drug networks to carry on unimpeded. The 1980s crack epidemic took a devastating toll on many inner cities, with the African American community being most strongly affected. Not only did the drugs lead to thousands of deaths, but harsh drug laws in response also brought disproportionate punishment onto African American inner city communities that many saw as an expression of racial discrimination. The publication of Webb's claims in 1996 caused a mixed reaction. The mainstream media leapt to the CIA's defense and dismissed Webb as a conspiracy theorist. Meanwhile, many African American activists and politicians took it as proof that the CIA had engineered the crack epidemic to harm their communities and ensure racial inequality. The truth was probably somewhere in the middle. The CIA admitted to knowing about the drug trade, but there's no evidence to suggest that they actively smuggled drugs or attempted to create an epidemic to harm American citizens. An internal CIA report claims there was no evidence that any CIA employee or asset had any direct role in the drug trade, and a later House of Representatives committee report reached a similar conclusion. Many still believed Webb and didn't trust the CIA to be honest about things. However, the media was so hostile to Webb that he was forced to leave journalism for good. Tragically, any hope of him returning to his investigation was dashed by his death in 2004. Webb was found dead in his house with multiple gunshot wounds to the head. It was ruled a suicide. Accusations of the CIA's drug trafficking don't stop there either. They appear again in the so-called secret war in Laos. With communist Vietnam on its border, Laos was a vital area of interest to the US because of its belief in domino theory. Like Vietnam, Laos was plunged into civil war between communist and anti-communist forces through the 1960s and 70s. Amidst this conflict, the CIA trained tens of thousands of anti-communist fighters, mostly among the Hmong ethnic group, to counter a rising tide of Vietnamese and Soviet-backed communist groups. This internal conflict is often forgotten next to its neighbor's more famous war, but it took tens of thousands of lives and created hundreds of thousands of Laotian refugees. Also forgotten is how Laos was dragged into the conflict between its neighbor and the US. The Ho Chi Minh Trail extended into Laos and was treated as a legitimate target for US bombing campaigns. As a result, Laos became a target for extensive bombing campaigns. Laos was bombed ruthlessly and had more bombs dropped on it than any other country in history relative to its population. Tens of thousands of Laotian civilians were killed by US bombing campaigns, and unexploded ordnance continued to take lives for decades afterwards. The CIA was central to all of this. The CIA played the leading role in supporting anti-communist groups and launched over 580,000 bombing campaigns over Laos over those years. Much like in Nicaragua, the CIA also became embroiled in the drug trade in order to support its newfound allies. The Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia, stretching across areas of Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar, produced the majority of the world's opium. Many of the CIA-backed groups depended on the sale of opium to support their efforts, and the CIA turned a blind eye to this deadly and devastating trade. Allegedly, following the capture of Hmong airfields by communist forces, the CIA began flying drugs on behalf of their new allies. Using Air America, a known CIA false front organization that was also the only American airline operating in the region, the CIA is said to have flown drug smugglers and traffickers throughout the region in order to keep the opium trade going. According to the journalist Alfred McCoy, the CIA also provided arms, transport, and protection to the drug lords of the Golden Triangle in exchange for their continued anti-communist support. With so little interest in the damage inflicted upon Laos by the US, it's anyone's guess whether we will know the truth of what happened. To this day, the CIA strongly denies any involvement in the drug trade of Southeast Asia, and recognition for the victims of US activity in Laos remains minimal. The CIA might deny any involvement with drugs in Southeast Asia, but you might have to be on drugs in order to come up with the next bizarre CIA scheme in the region. Throughout the 1960s, the CIA, in cooperation with the US Air Force, implemented a crazy weather modification project in Southeast Asia called Operation Popeye. Weather modification was a way to alter the environment in strategically advantageous ways, but many felt that it was a pipe dream. The US government felt different. They discovered that by deploying lead iodide and silver iodide from aircraft, they could form clouds and increase rainfall in a technique known as cloud seeding. It didn't take long for the CIA to begin considering the ways they could use this technology. The first use supposedly came in August 1963. Buddhist protests against the US-backed Diem regime in South Vietnam were proving difficult to disperse, until it was noticed that the rain always sent the crowds running. In response, the CIA took an Air America Beechcraft and successfully implemented cloud seeding above the protests to drive them away. Apparently, it was successfully used again in Saigon in 1964. The technique seemed to work, so inevitably it came into use during the Vietnam War. The CIA and US Air Force flew these missions over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia from 1967 to 1972 to worsen the monsoon season. The four key aims were soften road surfaces, making it harder to travel, cause landslides to cut off roads, wash out river crossings to cut off supply routes, maintain saturated soil conditions to make travel, agriculture, and other aspects of life more difficult. The technology was temperamental and unpredictable. It was difficult to know if they were genuinely having an effect or whether it was coincidence that the rain came after. On one occasion, a CIA source reported that the planes had accidentally caused 7 inches of rain in 2 hours over one of their own special forces camps. Despite the uncertainty, the US expended millions on the operation over the years, flying a total of 2,602 cloud seeding missions in the skies of Southeast Asia. When documents about the project came to light in 1974, a congressional investigation was launched. It was feared that using weather modification as a weapon would open a new arms race with devastating consequences. The CIA defended itself by saying that the project was ultimately ineffective, claiming that only 5% of rainfall in the operation areas was a result of Operation Popeye, results which it called limited and unverifiable. However, many wondered why the CIA and US Air Force spent tens of millions over several years for a project that they didn't think worked. To this day, many believe it was more effective than the US wanted to admit. Some believe that the devastating floods that hit North Vietnam in 1971, which killed around 100,000 people, were partially caused by the CIA's intervention. If that is true, then they would be only a fraction of the deaths that the CIA contributed to in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. As many people know, the US justification for entering the Vietnam War was 2 attacks by North Vietnamese ships on US patrols in the Gulf of Tonkin. However, in 2005, it was revealed that the CIA, NSA, and indeed the entire US leadership knew that the second attack never happened. Rather than exposing the error, the CIA wanted to get involved in the war, so the truth was buried and the American public were lied to. The rivers of blood from the Vietnam War thus remain, in large part, on the hands of the CIA. As we've already seen, the CIA was well at work during the war, but its most extended involvement came in the form of Operation Phoenix. Launched in 1967 and building upon existing operations in the region, Phoenix was a coordinated campaign designed to weaken the Viet Cong through sabotage, terrorism, and targeted assassinations. Phoenix involved some direct CIA action, but it was mostly an intelligence and coordination mission, using Vietnamese or American soldiers. One of the CIA strategies was to set up Revolutionary Development Cadres, RDs. These were a sort of parallel to the VC. These RDs would be sent out to the countryside or integrate into the local population and disseminate anti-communist ideas while acting as guerrilla fighters. Although they met with some success, it was reported that they ultimately did not accomplish much. They had a tendency to flee at the first sign of any armed resistance, proving far less capable of fighting than their VC counterparts. More effective were the Provincial Reconnaissance Units, or PRUs. These were special teams of South Vietnamese soldiers who were organized, trained, and equipped by the CIA. They functioned more like a special forces group, conducting small unit operations in VC-dominated territory using CIA intel. This included sabotage, assassination, and capture of high-value individuals. The CIA operated a sizable network of these PRUs for several years, and they proved remarkably effective. One US official even called them the most efficient unit in the entire Vietnam War. This effectiveness came with a grim reputation. The PRUs became known for thuggishness and brutality, with reports that they regularly killed civilians. When details of their activities emerged in the late 1960s and early 1970s, some critics called them civilian assassination squads. People familiar with the operations admitted that civilians had been killed during operations. One source claimed that if they were tasked with assassinating a VC informant, it was not unknown to kill the entire family just to be safe. However, others point out that the vast majority of PRU operations were to capture, not kill their targets. Capture did not mean these people were safe, though. Torture was a standard tool in the CIA repertoire, and this was no different. Beating, starvation, rape, and electrical torture were all reportedly used on detainees. And in one reported instance, the PRUs tried the insertion of a 6-inch dowel into the detainee's ears, through the brain until dead. Although most of this torture was not directly carried out by the CIA, they were certainly aware of it, and their continued support of these groups was a tacit endorsement of these methods. Eventually, the CIA proved incapable of overseeing Operation Phoenix alone, and MACV SOG took over much of the work. Despite this, the CIA remained heavily involved, particularly in the information sharing aspect of Phoenix. The CIA claimed that almost 82,000 targets were neutralized by Phoenix, of whom over 26,000 were killed, while others were kidnapped, tortured, or otherwise dealt with. There is no telling how many of these were legitimate targets and how many civilians found themselves innocently in the sights of the CIA and its allies. It should come as no surprise that no one in the CIA has faced any consequences for the actions described in this video. It seems that the only consequences come to people like Gary Webb, who suffer from tragic, completely non-suspicious suicides after exposing these events to the public. For every declassified secret, we have to wonder what has been brushed under the carpet. With no consequences for anyone in the CIA, we must also wonder if anyone ever learned their lesson. In 30 years' time, what new secrets will these sorts of videos talk about? Hopefully, we don't mysteriously disappear before we find out. If you enjoyed today's video and want more stuff like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.